Oh, well,
So
thank you so much
anyway,
for finding the time for us in the first place. I mean, that's we're truly honored and privileged by this opportunity. And
great. Well, I'm happy to go ahead. I'm just wondering. I don't see my signals a little bit slow. Is that okay for you?
it seems to be. I mean, we can handle it perhaps, but it
Yeah,
could be a bit slow. But there's
I
nothing
can't
much we can do about
do
it.
much about it.
Yeah, well, it's
I
just
think we'll just, yeah, okay.
let's put up with it. Well, I was reading the book, and there was just so many ways how to go about structuring the conversation to the extent that it can be structured in the first place. But as I wrote you in the email, once I read this, the encounter of Eastern and Western cosmologies, that kind of led me back to our previous interview with Kyriakos Markides, when the name of Houston Smith came up, and his notion that the 20th century was the time when the East and West came together as equals and in a significant way. So let's stick to this plan then and see where it takes us. I mean, this essay is like 40. You wrote it 40 years ago, I understand.
I did, yes. Well, it was a time, and Radhakrishnan was a very important influence on my thinking, and not only on my thinking, but also on my style. He just wrote extremely well, and you probably know that he was professor of Eastern religions and ethics at Oxford. And then he was ambassador to Moscow, and sent by Nehru, who said, "We are sending India to Moscow." And then he was vice president and subsequently president of India. And so it's a remarkable career, and really the foremost Indian philosopher, I think, of the 20th century.
Right. And let's take from there that you quote Fritjof Capra in the very beginning, and says that what we have at our hands is a crisis of perception. So I thought was a very interesting. But so, well, how did you? One thing was the influence of Radhakrishnan, but how did you? I mean, how did you get into that issue of kind of comparing Eastern and Western cosmologies in the first place?
Well, look, I'll just start with the crisis of perception, because this was a phrase that used in The Turning Point, which was the book written by Fritjof in 1980, and which I actually studied with my pupils at Winchester. And they got to read it and write essays about it. And I'd met Fritjof in 1978 in Cambridge, where Bernard Carr, who's now the president of the network and was a fellow at Trinity College, arranged a seminar with him at the college on the back of his book, The Tao of Physics. And of course, that was an early, with Zukov, that was an early important encounter, if you like, between East and West, between physics and mysticism. And in 1978, the network initiated the Mystics and Scientists conferences. And I didn't know about these until I went to Winchester to teach in 1980. And so in the spring of 1981, I attended my first Mystics and Scientists conference. And in 83, they had Rupert Sheldrake and David Bohm at the same conference. So that's when I met both of them. And Rupert has been a close friend, ever since. And so after that conference, I read Wholeness and the Implicate Order, which was Bohm's 1980 book. And I found it an extraordinary. I also read The Holographic Paradigm, and later some interviews by Rene Weber called Dialogues with Scientists and Sages. And so these books and conversations opened up this interface between East and West, which I'd already been familiar with Eastern religions and Western thought by Radhakrishnan, which was published, I mean, around the beginning of the Second World War. And so with Bohm, this extraordinary dynamic idea of wholeness and of unity inherent and implicate, what he called the implicate order, and that is primary, and out of this comes the explicate or separation or multiplicity. So the one gives rise to the many, if you like, but the many then, in spiritual terms, the journey is back towards the one. At least that's how I see it. And so it was very fertile, I think, just putting these two perspectives together, and in my own quest for wholeness, if you like, which has obviously gone on ever since.
Right. You say that the problem is that not the scope of the old view is inadequate. Well, it's not that the old view is wrong per se, but that the scope of the old view is inadequate. Could you just elaborate there? Well, let's put it that way. I mean, our newspaper is for the general readers, like pretty much like ourselves. So why should the average reader be interested in the questions of cosmology at all? Why do these things matter?
Why do they matter? Well, they matter because we live inside a paradigm or worldview, and that determines how we think, how we see the world, and how we understand a human being. And in fact, this morning, I haven't finished it yet, but I've just been reading and reviewing this book here, The Evil Twins of Technology and Transhumanism by Patrick Wood. And one of the things that I'm concerned with, and this does affect everybody, all the listeners here, is the mechanistic view of the human being. And if you regard humans as basically machines, biological machines, or what Yuval Noah Harari calls hackable animals, then you can do what you like with them. There's no dignity in the human being anymore. There's no inner life. There's no spiritual reality. And so the idea is to augment and enhance your cognitive capacities. There's no mention of the heart. So the point I'm driving at here is that the way we think of ourselves and the way, therefore, we think of our evolution and the meaning of life is very dependent on the prevailing paradigm, or highly influenced by the prevailing paradigm. And so everybody has a worldview, even if they don't realize it.
Yeah. I like very much that. I try to find the exact quote, but or the thinker who claims to be objective is wearing contact lens that he has forgotten about. I think that was that captures the essence what you just said, I think, very nicely.
Yes, I mean the point is that science, like any other activity, has underlying assumptions, and that's what Willis Harman famously said, quoting leading Richard Feynman, leading physicist, that philosophy of science is to scientists what ornithology is to birds. In other words, birds have no interest in ornithology, and scientism insists that there's no need for philosophy. And of course, there are many critics of scientism, such as the late Mary Midgley. And our whole kind of position within the network is to uphold science, but to be skeptical of scientism as an ideology.
Right. The other place I've kind of struck a chord with me was that the spirit of the age. Oh yeah, that the spirit of the age within, or the paradigm within which we work, is not itself graspable by the intellect, but it's more like an emotional tendency carried along by the force of suggestion. You referred to Jung here. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes. Jung, in terms of worldviews, Weltanschauung, as he said, he said we took for granted spirit, the primacy of spirit in the medieval period, and now we take for granted the primacy of matter. And I think and with materialism and consumerism and so on. And I think what's happening now is there's a gradual shift at the leading edge towards taking a position of the primacy of consciousness, or at least the fundamental importance or nature of consciousness in our scheme of reality. So I think there are two different positions here. One is that consciousness is actually primary. Another is more kind of dual aspect, which is a bit more like David Bohm, where you say that there's something that transcends and includes both mind and matter. So mind and matter emerge from some deeper order of reality. But what you're insisting on here is to refute, if you like, or rebut the primacy of matter on which science and technology has based itself since the 17th century.
Right. You also bring in Whitehead and stress upon the distinction between observational and conceptual order. What's
Yes, that's a subtle point. And so conceptual order is the tools, concepts, philosophy, ideas that you use to apply to the observational order, which is scientific observation and obviously involves experiments and the senses. And so that would include causality, for instance, and order itself, the idea that, and then various concepts within that. And so what Whitehead was doing, and this comes from Adventures in Ideas, is to clarify a distinction between these two orders, to say that you need both. You need both something, a way of observation, and then you need ideas with which you interpret those observations. And so if you could also say that on the one hand, you have perception, which is to grasp with. And then on the other hand, you have concepts, which are to grasp with. David Bohm was very clear about this, because he looked at the etymology of these terms, and that was one of the great things I derived from reading him. And pointed out, and Whitehead does this as well, he talks about comprehension. In fact, prehension is what Whitehead uses. But this idea of grasping is one way of, or one language, and the other language is that language of seeing, coming from theory, comes from theoria in Greek, which is contemplation. Theater comes from the same link. Right. And so we have these two ways of using, or two modes, if you like, a mode using seeing metaphors and a mode using grasping metaphors, which Iain McGilchrist, for instance, says is characteristic of the left hemisphere, to grasp, manipulate, and control. So this is another lens, if you like, but obviously not a lens that existed in 1983, because his work is all subsequent to that.
Yeah. You also say that each method is limited. Well, it's obviously so. Each method is limited in its understanding, that it's at length exhausted too. I mean, for me personally, the corona was like an apocalyptic event, which just like drew my attention to the things that I had not paid so much attention before, and so the limitations of the old paradigm. I mean, I feel have become so much apparent in the last couple of years. How do you share that?
Yes, well, that's a whole other topic, which there's quite a rabbit hole to go down. But yes, I do think that the notion of the biosecurity state has come to the fore, and in terms of public communication, the propaganda has been to create fear and to nudge us into certain types of behavior, and to prioritize only one interpretation of the events, only one kind of science, if you like, one narrative, and therefore to censor and cancel any contra-narrative or dissenting views or divergence of views or diversity of views. And so it's what Vandana Shiva would call a monoculture response. And this it's orthodoxy, if you like. There's orthodoxy and heresy. This would be another way of framing it within the Western tradition. So the orthodoxy is, quote, following the science, unquote, and the heresy is anything different.
Right.
And what happens to heretics? They're persecuted, cancelled, lose their jobs, lose their positions, marginalized, and it's still happening.
Right.
It's still happening. I listened to an interview between Jordan Peterson and Scott Jensen last week.
Oh yeah, so did I. Yeah.
And I find that very, very interesting because there's this relentless pursuit of people is such that the public then conclude wrongly that where there's smoke must be fire. And I was very struck when he said, "I've done nothing wrong."
Yeah.
And that kind of undercut them.
Yeah.
And so we're really in danger. And I write about this in my essay on Voltaire and Bertrand Russell, where danger of descending into a sort of one-party tyrannical state that trashes Enlightenment values of freedom of speech and expression. And of course, in your part of the world, you've had a lot more direct personal experience of that than we have in the West.
We did indeed. Well, coming back to this, the article that we agreed to take as a backbone for the conversation, you structured it like introduction, worldview. So basically saying that we have implicit worldview anyway. We look through we look at the world through lenses. The next structural unit is process. There you bring in Aristotle and Chinese philosophy, and talk about on one sense you say that Aristotle formulated Western philosophy on the basis of contradictions, whereas Chinese on the basis of complementarity. I think that seems to be an interesting or relevant point in a
yes. And I think there's, I mean, a lot more water has flown under the bridge. I actually read the Tao Te Ching every day, so it's one of my scriptures, and I try to live my life along those lines. And Iain McGilchrist also goes back to Heraclitus and the idea of flow and process being primary. And I think what's happened in biology, since that time, has really been to come much more to a process view, which is articulated by Whitehead, but also by Bergson, Henri Bergson, who had a big influence on Rupert Sheldrake. And of course, if I use the McGilchrist lens, then he would say that the right hemisphere apprehends and goes with and understands process, but the left hemisphere is all about abstraction. It's trying to take a point or create a distinct idea of something that is actually continuous and flowing. And so the point that we're getting to, I think, and John Dupre also talks about this in Philosophy of Biology, is the primacy of process, and which of course is difficult for us in terms of concepts, because a concept can't actually grasp a process. You have to relate to it. I mean, we have a river outside. I can hear it at the moment, and the river, of course, is the archetypal image of process, which Hermann Hesse also uses in Siddhartha, for instance.
So that's kind of sympathetic. Is that related to the notion of sympathetic knowledge that you also bring in this very piece?
Yes. Well, that in turn relates to Goethean science. I think that when you're contemplative rather than observational, then you try to become one with what you're contemplating. If you observe it, you're detached. You know, the detached observer is the archetype there, but the contemplator, the poet, becomes what they are studying. And a couple of well-known examples of this would be Barbara McClintock, who's Nobel Prize winner in biology. She describes how she became the cells that she was studying and was able to understand the process through that and gain, radical insights. And then the other example that springs to mind is Viktor Sheldrake, who understood water by sympathetically or empathetically becoming water. And so this is ideally, that's what kind of right hemisphere function, I think. But in order to advance, we have to use both hemispheres together. And so Iain describes this by saying, well, you have to apprehend with the right, then it gets elaborated by the left, and then the left sends it back to the right for further synthesis. And so we have to be very subtle and nuanced in our own way of understanding things, and take time to be in nature, to be with trees, to be with rivers, to be with flowers.
Yeah, that's that's what we personally have done. Well, in his book, Science and Spiritual Practices, which has been I translated it into Estonian, and which been immensely important for me. Rupert advises us to choose one tree as our friend, and that's what we've done, and it really over time kind of willy-nilly changes the perception of nature, and it really, I mean, at first it looked like a strange thing to do, but over time it just does things, and again shifts the perception somehow, which is needed, I think. Yeah.
Yes, well, that's really about how to have a richer everyday life, and of course it's more difficult for people who are in cities, unless there are nice parks to go to. But I live in a small village, and so we're right in the middle of the country, effectively.
Well, you read just a little break from this, from the main line of the stories. You read Viktor Frankl. Do you have anything to?
Yeah, last week I had a flight to Vienna, and that was exceptionally good timing for reading Viktor Frankl. And I read his book, Yes to Life. And you also touched at the very beginning the meaning of life, and what he is writing, and what was so sympathetic for me, that the meaning of life is as a central human motivational force, and even through suffering and death. As he's describing there, that those people who had this motivational force, they survived better and longer than others. That what do you think about this meaning of life?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because only last night I reopened my PDF copy of Yes to Life. Because I'm going to review it along with Etty Hillesum, Uninterrupted Life. She was a Dutch writer who was part of the organization and deportation of 100,000 Jews from the Netherlands. And it's a very, very moving and touching book. And what she found meaning in her suffering in a similar way. And so I wanted to reflect on the comparisons between the experience and message of Frankl and that of Etty Hillesum, who didn't survive. You know, she was deported to Auschwitz, as were her parents, and she died at the end of 1943. But the human message and profundity is the same, that there is an indestructible diamond or core to the human spirit, which if you tune into, as you say, enables you to survive and enables you to perceive and experience meaning, even in the most terrible circumstances. I mean, Frankl quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why can bear almost any how."
Right.
And so Frankl argues, and a lot of people find this difficult, that there must be meaning in suffering. And if you go to, I'm a spiritual teacher who's my main lighthouse, if you like, is Peter Deunov. And he says that, you know, suffering is the way that we really learn profound lessons. And I think our life experience you know, demonstrates that or testifies to that. And often it's the hardest experiences that we have. When we emerge from them, we're glad we went through them, even if it wasn't very nice at the time.
Right, that's very, very true.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
as we are here in Frankl's mode right now, there was another sentence which somehow touched me. That was that there are two races of men, decent and indecent. And that was somehow hard to believe for Frankl, or not hard to believe, but to understand that in prisoners there were also indecent people, and those who were capos were in some time very decent, just giving a small bit of bread to
The prisoner guard, you mean?
Yeah.
Prison guards.
Yes.
The structure with decency and decency between the prisoners and the guards was pretty much the same.
And if we look at our nowadays life, it's the same, that you can't just say that those people are good and those are bad. Those are decent, those are indecent. There are mix in.
Yes. No, I agree. I mean, that's really, we all have these aspects. But I think one of the important points is what features of human nature or characteristics are brought out by particular systems or situations. And obviously the Auschwitz prison guard situation is a very specific one. And the prison guards were themselves, you know, kept in fear and in a very repressive system. And so if they kind of stepped out of it, then they might be killed themselves. And it's, I mean, there's a novel by Jules Vercors, which I remember teaching, called Le Silence de la Mer. And it's about a Gestapo officer who is billeted with French people during the resistance period. And he's a very cultured man, but at the same time, he's a Gestapo officer. And so it's hard to, you know, square that circle. But there is, Jung obviously realized that, you know, we all have these shadows. There's a individual shadow and collective shadow, and the projection of the enemy image, which you can see very clearly on the sort of geopolitical scene at the moment, that, you know, we're the good guys and the other people are the bad guys. And then you reinforce this polarized view, you know, through propaganda messages.
Right.
You know, in the news, and you stir up people's emotions to hatred and so on. And it's not really a very constructive way forward, I don't think.
Yeah, well, that's a Peterson argument. war between West and Russia is to some extent the continuation of the civil war or the internal war that we have inside.
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah. No,
that,
I mean it's another very big topic.
Yeah.
And one which I've been following quite closely. And one of my friends is a man called Alfred Desires, and he was a UN special representative, independent expert on global order, and he has written a book where he sets out 24 principles of global order, which is a visionary contribution. But so long as we have a system that prioritizes national interests, power over our common interests, then those principles will not be applied. And yet, in an evolutionary sense, going towards more peaceful order, if you like, some such principles have to be understood and applied. We can't go on as we are.
That's very true. Coming back now to the Eastern and Western cosmologies, well, just I understand the basic problem throughout the history of philosophy is, on the one hand, Heraclitus, everything is in flux. Parmenides saying everything is stable. Got the Plato's compromise there in between, which is kind of a foundation for the Western philosophy. How does Bohm, in his modular reality, deviate from Plato? I think that would be interesting.
Yes, no, that's an interesting question. Of course, Bohm comes from physics, but also philosophy, and he had, as you know, deep conversations with Moriarty and other teachers, and so he was sort of trying to synthesize what he knew about the principles of physics and coming up with an alternative view to the Copenhagen interpretation. And so it's the image, it's the model. I mean, the model he used a lot was the sort of droplet that you could turn a handle, and the droplet would extend into something separate, and then you could turn the handle back and fold it right back in, which is actually a slightly too concrete an image, because I think in terms of traditional philosophy, what his model is really a model of the one and the many. And so the one is represented by the implicate order, but the implicate order is dynamic. It's a process in motion, movement, and it's inherently dynamic. Whereas the Platonic idea is static, it's not dynamic. And then out of the whole process of the explicate coming out of the implicate is itself dynamic. And I think in Deunov, this is expressed both in his philosophy, but also in his dance. And so there's a sequence of dance called the sunbeams. And the symbolism there is that you move backwards and forwards from unity and then away from unity as involution, and then back towards unity as evolution. And so you actually dance those movements, which are symbolic of the whole process of descent and ascent, of coming into density and then moving away from density. And this is a kind of Gnostic narrative, which I very much have sympathy with. And I regard this, I call this the cosmic game. So the cosmic game is to forget and remember, to go to sleep and wake up, to come into density and then return to the light. And I think that's what we're doing. At least that's what I understand we're doing.
Right. Well, interesting that they brought up the term cosmic game. Actually, we're doing one of our activities here, so that there are we have two course series. One is Great Books, and the other is A Return of Nature, which is named after the Sheldrake's lecture here 3 years ago. And in this course series, we'll cover the thinkers who are, well, it's basically introduction to modern heresies.
Okay. Yeah.
And the 5th season is called Cosmic Game, and it's focuses on the eponymous book by Stanislav Grof. What do you think of his work and his work in general, and this book in particular?
Well, I've actually just been editing an article for the latest or the current issue, which I'm editing, of the journal, which gives an account of his work in relation to Ervin Laszlo's Cosmic Akashic Field. And I think, it's no doubt that Stan, and he is an honorary member of the network, along with Rupert and a number of others, has made an absolutely fundamental contribution to our understanding of ourselves and of transpersonal psychology. And I think his work is now being vindicated at another level with the return of psychedelic psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And we have an event on this actually in a week or two. And, because this
in the network, you mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mike Sapiro is talking about it in our webinar series. And so, and that's something that's now becoming mainstream. And it veered off course because of the counterculture in the 1960s. Otherwise, we might be further along the road than we are now. But at any rate, his works has been vindicated.
Right, and again, coming back to the structure of the aforementioned article, the first part, worldviews, which we've covered, process, everything is in movement, in Bohm's model, right? The underlying, the whole of movement, the implicate order, and also the explicit order, right? So movement is inherent in all this. But how does that relate to this idea that everything is in movement, to Tao and Brahman, the other two concepts that you bring in there?
Well, those are different. They're obviously different contexts and cultures, but the Tao is inherently flowing, and the river is an image of that. But the Tao is the Chinese equivalent of the implicate order. I think,
right?
Because it's the origin of things. It's the origin and the principle. The way is implied in the Tao, and it's a way of non-resistance. It's a way of gentleness. It's a feminine way, if you like. And the Divine Feminine I Ching by Rosemary Anderson is the one that I read. And I've just got back to the beginning, literally today, because I got to chapter 81. So I keep going back through it. The 81st poem. And then the Brahman is the absolute, the transcendent, the ground of being in Hindu philosophy, as explained by Radhakrishnan. And the Atman is the divine self, and which ultimately becomes one with the Brahman. And so again, what you're talking about is an emergence from unity and a return to unity. So there's a structural similarity. So everything originates with the Tao, and everything returns to it. Mm-hmm. And another person who I hadn't read at the time, but who has a similar metaphor, is Walter Russell, and who was an extraordinary genius. He lived from 1872 to like 1970. No, got that slightly wrong, but he was more or less a contemporary with Bertrand Russell. But he used the terms unfolding and refolding, very similar to Bohm.
Yeah.
And in fact, I asked Basil Hiley if he knew whether Bohm had ever read Walter Russell, because the whole process, and I use this in my poetry as well, that what's happening in nature in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment is this process of unfolding. And Deunov in his Paneurythmy, it's represented by the first movement, which is awakening. And it's breathing out using a Goethean sense. And then in the autumn, then everything is refolded, so that our lives are an unfolding and death is a refolding. And in fact, on Walter Russell's grave, it doesn't say died on such and such a date, it says refolded. And I like this idea, because it's really only the one, for me, there's only the one life and the one mind. And we are expressions, we're all expressions of this, which means we're all inherently rooted in the, quote, implicate order.
Right.
We're rooted in the oneness of mind and consciousness, so that ethically, that's the ontology, so that ethically we are one another. And therefore we should treat each other as if we were one being, if you like. Right. And we're a long way at the moment, but it's coming, I think.
Yeah. Just a purely practical matter. I'm already trying to think how to translate implicate order. So how would you say synonymously in English? What's the other way of saying what?
Of saying what?
Implicate order. How would you? What other? Just purely.
Well, I mean, to the root of implicate is to enfold.
Enfold, yeah.
Yeah, and so something that's explicit is unfolded. So explicate is unfolded.
Okay.
And explanation also means to unfold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's.
And so this is very interesting. And the notion of so we have an intuitive wholeness of thought, and then we unfold it into sentences and language, and then we see whether we've expressed it with sufficient clarity and precision. And if not, that's the left hemisphere. We try again. But in fact, meaning and understanding are implicit. They're tacit, as Michael Polanyi would say. They're not. So if we understand something, we know that we understand it, but it's a knowing, it's a knowingness that is the key. And we can only thus feel it and sense it.
Right. I mean, just from other article or essay in this collection, you write about John Moriarty, whom I had heard the name before, but that was the first piece on him that I've read, and I think that's highly relevant also to the main topic of our conversation today. That he says that the next big revolution in science will be epistemological, and I think we started off from Fritjof Capra that we have a crisis of perception, and is that how much different, or is it different from the epistemological crisis that seems to be to which John Moriarty refers?
Yes, well, John was an extraordinary man who I met on a number of occasions, and one of them was at a castle just on the outskirts of Dublin, in front of an enormous fire with 6-foot logs. And we had a 1-hour conversation, a live TV conversation on life, the universe, and everything, with a nice pint of Guinness, to help the conversation along. And John, when he spoke, it was like poetry coming out of his mouth. He had the most extraordinary linguistic and rhetorical skill, which was part of his his charm. And he worked as a gardener most of his life, having begun life as a lecturer at University of Manitoba in Canada. He did that for 6 years, and then he took his pension and started working as a gardener and a writer. So that's all by way of background. But the epistemological crisis, if you like, is really, again, one of limitation. And so and that goes partly back to Goethean science, but a simple way of expressing this is in the 3 eyes of Saint Bonaventure. He said we have the eye of sense, which was the sensory experience. Then we have the eye of reason, which is our logical eye, our analytical eye, if you like. And then we have the eye of the heart, or the eye of contemplation, which is where we become what we know. And this is gnosis in the Western tradition. So gnosis is to become something at a deeper level, and you know it because you are it. Knowing and being come together. So you find this in the mystical experience, in the near-death experience, where people become light, they become love.
There's an experiential component to it, right?
Correct, yes. And so one of the thrusts of our work in the Galileo Commission is to reinstate gnosis and the eye of contemplation as part of the Western understanding. Because if you go back to the Greek philosophers, philosophy was not an abstraction, it was a way of life. And the people who were regarded as the sophists, the sophists in the Platonic dialogues, they were the language crunchers and people who thought it's just about ideas and argument. And that, of course, dominates philosophy departments. Whereas philosophy in its true sense of love of wisdom is all about life. And so I think that epistemologically, we're arguing for the reinstatement of the validity of gnosis as a way of knowing.
Right. Then your worldviews, process, underlying reality, and then the big structural unit is God. How do and I think the piece that I made the extensive notes, but the one that I put circle around is that Whitehead characterizes this trusting of the many forms towards the one as the basis of religions. So I don't think we've talked about Whitehead, or did we mention Whitehead in this?
Yes, only through process at an earlier point. But Whitehead's idea of God is both transcendent and immanent.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a prior nature, he calls, which is the transcendent nature, and then the immanent nature, which becomes in the process of evolution and is affected by it. And that's the key point, is affected by it. So God is in the process as well as being beyond it. Right. And the Upanishads always say that, you need both of these elements. You need the element of transcendence and the element of immanence. Otherwise, if you only go with one, you fall into deep darkness, they say.
Oh yeah, you mentioned it there.
And I feel that's very important, because the traditional religions sometimes overemphasize transcendence, and more sort of humanist orientation would major on immanence and say there's no transcendence at all. Right. And this doesn't correspond to the deepest of human experience, in my view. But it's the view taken by mechanistic materialism, which insists on the primacy of matter and that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain.
Yeah, but how does the pantheistic revolution in theology that Sheldrake has mentioned has emphasized how does that fit into this?
Yes, well, I think there's two things going on, and I've talked to Rupert about this. One is the emergence of panpsychism within philosophy. So quite a few philosophers or neuroscientists like Christoph Koch and Philip Goff, they are now articulating, instead of a materialist view, they're articulating a panpsychic view. But I think by and large, they're still excluding transcendence. And so they're coming from immanently from within the system and the process of becoming. But I don't think they yet recognize something beyond, which of course Rupert himself does. So again, there are different views you can take, but panentheism is God both within and beyond, and that's my view. I think it's Matthew Fox's view as well. And it's consistent with what I was saying earlier, that we need both transcendence and immanence.
Right.
But,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this expression of darkness reminded me one Friedrich Nietzsche's quote, which is that I am a forest and a night of dark trees.
Yeah.
But he who is not afraid of my darkness will find banks full of roses under my cypresses.
Cypresses, yeah.
Cypresses.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a wonderful line. That's a wonderful line. Well, there's a fertile aspect to darkness, isn't there? That's darkness. The light emerges from the darkness. The plants emerge from the dark earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've approached the end of the hour. The one thing I'd quite like to ask you. I mean, I was trained to be economist, and I stayed in this profession overstayed for that profession for like 2 decades at least. But how do you that you also had studied economics in the university and worked for the merchant bank? How do you look at your economic education?
Well, in the
economics,
yes, in the 1970s in St Andrews, it was still called political economy.
Okay, not economics.
Not economics. It became economics while I was there, but political economy was the old-fashioned way of talking about economics, and I think very apt, because your politics inform your economics, and your economics informs your politics. And so the development of economics is really mathematization, quantification. It removes the qualitative, and that's partly what we've been talking about today, is the qualitative as a complement to the quantitative, and we need both these aspects. And so, I mean, I still have what you might call an economic literacy. And so I can read and understand. I mean, I was just reviewing yesterday a book called Earth for All, which is a new report to the Club of Rome. And that's mainly about macroeconomics and what measures governments can take in order to, quote, pull the levers. And of course, I say in my review that pulling the levers is very mechanistic. And so people are unconsciously using this mechanistic language, and it loses sight of lived experience. So I don't read much sort of technical economics, but I do support the new economics institutes and also the embedding of economics within ecology. And so I read all the books and reviewed them all of Lester Brown, the Earthwatch Institute, who was working on this from 50 years ago or so, and he used to produce the State of the World every year. And oddly enough, his work's not mentioned in this new report at all, and yet, he was a real pioneer in what he called an eco-economy. And so I think that's my general thrust, that we need to emphasize the primacy of ecology within which the economy sits, rather than prioritize the economy and try and adapt the ecology to it. Right. And so I'm a very strong supporter of regeneration, and a regenerative approach, of decentralized approaches, localization, mutual support, mutual aid, reciprocity, all these indigenous principles that I think we need to recover at every level.
Right. Anything from you?
Yeah, this Frankl is in my body still. So Frankl talking about this meaning of life, and one of his book is Meaning of Life. I haven't read it, but I very shortly looked.
Search of meaning, man's search of meaning, right?
Yeah, man's search of meaning, exactly. And if Frankl talking about meaning of life, or this meaning, and he's also talking about responsibility. And one quote I found from Frankl, which refers to responsibility, is that human freedom is not a freedom from, but freedom to.
Yes. No, I think that's really that's a good definition of responsibility. And it goes with it. To be free is to be responsible, and responsibility is the proper use of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So I very much agree with this. But I think the overall point he's also making is an affirmation of meaning, whereas the current materialistic mechanistic science
There is no
says there isn't any.
No.
There's no meaning. It's all random. And that again is something that, as a culture, we need to push back against. Also because of the mental, emotional, and spiritual health of our young people,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is severely undermined by being told that life is just a meaningless episode, and you better just make the most of it and get on and at the expense of other people. But I don't think that's a helpful message at all.
Mm-hmm.
And just the very last question. We started off with well, actually the idea that gave rise to this the structure of this conversation was the quotation by Houston Smith that the 20th century, that if the historians from 500 years look back at the 20th century, it's not the atomic bomb or the communism that captures their attention, but the fact that that was the first time when East and West came together, not only significantly, but as equals. Do you agree with that? And what do you think of him? I've also discovered Houston Smith quite recently and been fascinating, really, truly fascinated by him. So what do you think of him in general and his book, The World Religions in particular?
Yes. Well, I knew him because I invited him to a Mystics and Scientists conference about 20 years ago. And I admire his work on comparative religion. He did also some work on hallucinogens, and he did a critique of scientism, where he said, actually, if he gave a lecture about it, then scientists would come up at the end and say, well, there's not really any difference between science and scientism, which is precisely the point, of course, he was trying to make. There was a difference. But I think, obviously, the encounter between East and West has been going on for a few centuries. But the influence, or the widespread influence of Eastern views, I mean, at a popular level, that came in with the 1960s and the Beatles and meditation, and the Dalai Lama being exiled, and Tibetan Buddhism spreading to the West, and that's been a hugely significant development. But I think what we're seeing now is the gradual emergence of a multipolar world.
Mm-hmm.
And this obviously is what Russia and China have been arguing for against the American hegemon, that to dominate the world by force. And it seems to me that from a sort of natural philosophy point of view, that nature always works through biodiversity and through cooperation and collaboration. There is competition, but ultimately the direction for me is is unity and diversity. And that implies that we have to respect each other as cultures. We have to listen to each other. We have to exchange openly, rather than insisting that our view is better and needs to be imposed on everybody else, and which is a uniformity view, which is a monoculture. And so I believe passionately that we need to follow this understanding of how nature works in terms of unity and diversity and biodiversity, and apply that to culture as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We're truly honored by this.